The Gospel of Mark's structure and Christology. Unlike the Gospel of Matthew, which is relatively well structured, the Gospel of Mark apparently demonstrates no strict visible framework. Scholars have tried hard to discern a structure intrinsic to Mark with varying degrees of success and often conflicting results depending on their points of view. However, almost all would agree that the Gospel can be divided into three stages from 1 to 13, then chapter 1 14 to chapter 8 27, and chapter 8 27 to chapter 16 8, with Peter's declaration of Jesus in 8:27, that is, he is the Messiah. Obviously, the structure of any text is directly related to its contents and development. So, the structure of Mark will reveal to us what the gospel is talking about. But the corollary is also true. An insight into the main ideas of Mark will reveal to us the structure of the gospel. Hence, two important related questions we should be raising is, what is the gospel of Mark all about? What is the structure of the gospel which reveals towards its message? A central question being posed by the readers is often connected with the interpretation of certain gospel texts, either the miracles or the parables of Jesus or some of his sayings. The cardinal rule for interpreting any text of the gospel is that it has to be interpreted within the whole of the gospel. Isolating texts, trying to interpret them independently, is a sure recipe for failure. A rule of thumb would be to examine the text in relation to what precedes it and what comes directly after the text, or within the overall structure of the section in which the text is placed. This rule is a direct application of the fact that each evangel used the underlying story of Jesus as the foundation to build up a narrative about Jesus addressable to the needs of a particular community. Thus, each evangelist gives his own meaning to an event, a saying, or a miracle of Jesus, which may be slightly different from the original meaning. This nuanced meaning is in continuity with the original meaning of the event. Furthermore, they are addressing temporal and often spatial distance between the reader and the text. The text is capable of taking on new meanings as it speaks to various different groups of people. Furthermore, with the increasing temporal and often spatial distance between the reader and the text is capable of taking on new meanings as it speaks to various different groups of people. However, these meanings are not arbitrary but are also in continuity with the original meaning of the text and the interpretation by the living faith community which supports such an understanding of the text. What is the purpose of the gospel? Is Mark trying to retell a new story about Jesus? Definitely, there existed in the community many possible oral as well as written stories about Jesus. However, the purpose of Mark was not to merely retell these own known stories of Jesus, but to use these stories to weave a narrative about Jesus with a definitive theological thrust. Mark is trying to teach his community something about Jesus, especially with regard to his identity. Who is Jesus? And what does it mean to follow him in the present context? For the Markan community facing a lot of opposition, persecution, and suffering in Rome. The Markan community facing a lot of opposition, persecution, suffering in Rome, they kept asking the question, how can one be a disciple of Jesus in such a difficult situation? How do we make sense of the number of fellow Christians who have left the faith because of the persecutions? How do we make sense of betrayals in the community? Does following Christ have to be so painful? It is these considerations that Mark influences Mark's portrayal of Jesus and his disciple. Jesus is portrayed as a faithful Son of God who is faithful to the will of God until the cross. Jesus and his disciples are portrayed in a bad light, whereas they are seen as unfaithful, slow to understand. This only goes on to show the reader that they should emulate Jesus in his faith, will not be like the disciples who are slow in understanding and give up so easily. However, such a picture can only be built by reading the whole gospel. While the gospel is more than just some of its parts, it is how the various texts of the gospel are brought together, how they influence and the interpretation of each other. Hence, rather than concentrating merely on individual texts, we must look at the gospel as a whole and put it all together. To give an example of how different texts modify each other, we shall take the example of Mark 5 verses 21 to 43, which is the miracle of raising of Jairus' daughter and the healing of the woman suffering from hemorrhages by touching the cloak of the. Mark uses the literary technique of intercalcation, which is involving splitting the narration of an incident in two parts and inserting another incident between the two halves, whereby the two events cast an interpretive light on each other. In this particular case, it only goes on to show that this woman, through her healing, is also in a certain way raised from death to life. Mark uses this technique also in the miracle of cursing of the fig tree in Mark 11, which is continued in Mark 11:20-22, sandwiching the cleansing of the temple. Thus, this becomes a symbolic miracle. Jesus sends his disciple in chapter 6, verses 6 to 13, on a preaching and healing mission, and they return in 6:30. In between, Mark has placed the story of the violent death of John the Baptist at the whim of the political powers. 6:14 to 29, raising the question of the fate of the disciples. Similarly, statements about the attitudes of Jesus' family towards him in chapter 3, verses 20 to 21, 31 to 35 form the frame for a conflict story centering on the attitudes of the scribes toward Jesus in chapter 3, 22 to 30, and incites the reader to compare the two sets of attitudes. Having said this, how does one discern a structure within Mark? One can look for patterns by which Mark organizes his gospel. For instance, in the first chapter, Mark gives us Jesus' typical program of the day, ending with the statement in 139. Similarly, he groups a set of pericopes trying to demonstrate the growing conflict between Jesus, the scribes, and the Pharisees. Similarly, he groups various parables together, chapter 4. Often, two similar events group a full bunch of events together in a technical device called as inclusion. For instance, the family of Jesus in chapter 3 and the rejection of Jesus of Nazareth in chapter 6. Similarly, the two incidents of Jesus healing the blind man also forms an inclusion of the section from chapter 8:27 to chapter 10:52. We must understand that most biblical literature of the New Testament was not written as we write our modern text with paragraphs, headings and subheadings, but it was a continuous block and needed such rhetorical and literary devices to maintain a structure and hence tell a story. How do we begin to understand the Gospel of Mark? A good starting point would be the community to which it was addressed, the needs and the questions of that community. Why did Mark write this Gospel? Mark was the first to write any Gospel and in a way invented a literary genre of the Gospel. Gospel means good news, and Jesus preached essentially the good news of God. However, this is different from the literary genre of the gospel, which is instead weaving a story about who Jesus is. While the letters of Paul mainly focus on explaining the saving act of Jesus' death and resurrection, the theological and spiritual and practical implications of it, he really does not focus on explaining who Jesus is. On the other hand, Mark is really telling us a story about the good news of Jesus, the Son of God, and is hence basically trying to tell the readers who Jesus is. Hence, a good starting point for us to understand the gospel is to ask that question, who is Jesus? In order to do this, Mark takes the various incidents he has heard about Jesus, the events of his life, his sayings, his parables, his miracles, and above all his passion, death, and resurrection, and tries to use these basic fundamentals to weave a story to explain who Jesus is. While he does use historical facts, he uses them in his own way to explain his own theological message. Hence, the Gospel of Mark is a mixture of both historical and theological nature. Scholars are divided on what is history and what is not. Certain passages are pure Markan theological construction and must be recognized as such. Rating whether text based on its historicity is missing the point of the main gospel. Rather, our main purpose is to understand the theological message of the whole gospel. The Gospel of Mark can be understood using the two following interrelated questions. Who is Jesus? What does it mean to be Christian disciple today? The question of Jesus' identity was a defining question for the Christians of the first century. However, the Gospels are convinced that one can only learn Jesus' identity by developing a relationship with him through discipleship. Christian discipleship is the key for understanding who Jesus is. Similarly, the corollary is also true. We can only understand what it means to be a disciple of Jesus today if we understand who Jesus is. Now, understanding Jesus implies first of all understanding his message. Hence, the kingdom of God is intrinsically connected with the person of Jesus. We are not only understanding Jesus through the various titles used for him in the Gospel of Mark, like Messiah, Son of God, Son of David, but we are also beginning to understand who Jesus is by understanding what the kingdom of God is all about and its working to bring forth the kingdom of God in discipleship. On the other hand, our understanding of the kingdom of God has a direct correlation with our understanding of how to be a Christian disciple today. Hence, we have three important related concepts, which is technical terms are read as Christology, kingdom of God, and discipleship. Insights into these three related concepts are dotted throughout the Gospel and form a thread which runs from start to finish. The whole Gospel is about Jesus revealing himself and the kingdom of God, and his disciples slowly beginning to understand what following Jesus is all about. A central question of the Gospel of Mark is his Christology. How is Jesus progressively revealed in the Gospel? Among the various characters in the narrative, we can list God, Jesus, the disciple, the scribes, the Pharisees, the crowds, the demons. By considering how these various other characters consider and evaluate Jesus, as well as Jesus' own self-understanding, we could in some way derive the identity of Jesus. While we have no direct access to the perspective of God on Jesus, his view on the subject is revealed through a number of subtle ways. First of all, with the quotation from the Old Testament in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, and then in the two theophanies where the voice of God is heard, the baptism of Jesus and the transfiguration of Jesus. All the three confirm in a way the divine status of Jesus, who is the Son of God, and that what Jesus preaches and does is conformity with the will of God. Notice who the narrator presents Jesus preaching the good news of God in verse 1:14. However, the voice at the baptism of Jesus is only heard by Jesus and the reader. Mark treats the theme of Jesus' identity in verse 1:14 to verse 8:26 by fashioning a contrapuntal pattern according to the demonic shout that Jesus is the Son of God, alternate with questions human characters pose about who Jesus could conceivably be. On the one hand, the demons are transient beings, know the secret of Jesus' identity, although their shouts are suppressed or uttered in private confrontation so that the human ear remains untouched by them. Because their evaluative point of view concerning Jesus' identity is in accord with that of God. On the other hand, alternating with those demonic shouts are the human characters posed as to who Jesus might be. In the synagogue at Capernaum, the people astounded at the exorcism Jesus has just performed inquire about his identity by querying one another about this powerful act. "What is this?" they exclaim, "a new teaching with authority." In the house at Capernaum, some of the scribes, provoked by the fact that Jesus should dare to forgive a paralytic his sins, reason in their heart, "How does this man speak thus? He blasphemes. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" After Jesus calms the storm, the disciples ask one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And in the synagogue in Nazareth, they ask, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" All these questions often are from different groups of people, are asked in the spirit of amazement, born of incomprehension by the Jewish people, or of utter disapprobation by the authorities, or fear springing from cowardice and lack of faith by the disciples, or by repudiation rooted in unbelief by family, relatives, and acquaintances of people. On purpose, therefore, Mark, through his contrapuntal pattern, juxtaposes the demonic knowledge and the human ignorance, and the reader is constantly reminded that Jesus is the Son of God, while realizing that human characters wonder incomprehensibly who he is. Another source of revelations are the miracles of Jesus, especially those miracles which have the messianic overtones, like in Luke 7:18 to 35, Matthew 11:2 to 19. These four miracles: healing of the leper in 1:40 to 45, raising Jairus' daughter to life 5:21 to 24, 35 to 43, healing of a deaf and dumb man in 7:31 to 37, and the healing of a blind man in chapter 8:22 to 26. In Mark have some specific features, namely the event occurs in privacy and they are accompanied by the command to secrecy. Sometimes the command is obeyed while other times it is violated. However, a similar miracle of healing the blind man Bartimaeus has no command to secrecy in chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. Taken together, the demonic recognition of Jesus' identity and Jesus' injunction of silence on the demons and the beneficiaries of certain miracles only occur in the first part of the Gospel, until the point where the first human being realizes who Jesus is. That is, Peter declares Jesus as the Messiah. After this, there is no command to secrecy. This shows that Peter's declaration of Jesus is a kind of watershed in the development of Mark. However, Peter's declaration of Jesus shown to be inadequate in chapter 8 verses 31 to 33. His understanding of Messiah was still restricted within human categories and not corresponding to what God had planned for Jesus. The remaining part of the gospel would be spent in correcting the image of who Jesus is. The section 8:27 to 10:52 dealing on the way of the Son of Man and discipleship corrects the image of Messiah proposed by Peter in order to indicate that Jesus is a Messiah destined to suffer and die at the hands of the Jews, but who on the third day will be raised from the dead. This revelation of Jesus in the form of the passion prediction is confirmed by a divine voice at Transfiguration. At the end of the session, Bartimaeus, a blind man, reviews Jesus as the son of David. This points to the Davidic sonship of Jesus. Mark claims to Davidic lineage for Jesus, the man from Nazareth. Remember that Mark does not speak about the infancy narratives where Jesus is originally from Bethlehem. First of all, Mark shows that Jesus is son of David, not as a warrior king, but one who wields his royal authority in order to have mercy on an afflicted man as Bartimaeus to heal and in this manner to save. Secondly, Mark prepares the way for the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, but nuances the notion of kingship to show that Jesus entered Jerusalem peacefully riding on a colt, a symbol of simplicity and peace. While this reveals something more about the person of Jesus, his messianship, and the kingdom of God, it is still insufficient. It is corrected further in the narrative. It is only later at Passion and Death that the Roman centurion will declare that Jesus is the Son of God. Notice that it is an outsider, a Roman centurion, who declares that Jesus is the Son of God. Secondly, it is the final act of Jesus' dying that prompts this acclamation. Finally, at the end of the story, Mark allows a human character to adopt God's point of view and to think about Jesus. The God thinks about him. The message of Mark is clear. It is only by following Jesus to his passion and death, by taking up our own crosses to follow him, that we will be able to recognize him for who he truly is and to be finally converted and to have true faith in him.